Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Rashida Bumbre, and I'm the Director of Culture and Art at the Open Society Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for a very timely discussion, which is co-hosted by the Culture and Art Program and the Open Society US. The Open Society Foundations is a global organization that works to build vibrant and tolerant societies whose governments are accountable and open to the participation of all people. While our organization supports and works on a vast array of subjects related to justice and human rights, the Culture and Art Program focuses specifically on the intersection of culture, art, and social change. History shows us that during times of crisis, especially when open society comes under attack, artists, curators, and cultural workers can play an essential role as voices of conscience and reason that help summon new political realities. As author Arundhati Roy rightfully stated earlier this year, the pandemic is a portal. The COVID-19 pandemic is not just a public health crisis. Black, Brown, and Indigenous populations have been disproportionately affected and killed by the virus, whereas the resilience of anti-Asian xenophobia has also put Asian communities under attack. The pandemic has resurfaced persistent racism, oppression, and violence that have been embedded in and abetted by Western-based health models and frameworks for many centuries. Tonight, recognizing the power of the radical imagination, we have gathered Kara Page, Jack Chen, and Annika Yee, a panel of scholars, cultural producers, and creatives who are not confined only by Western frameworks of health. Instead, they look to healing, liberation, and co-subjectivity. Together, we will explore tonight the role of healing in political liberation, social justice, and well-being. Tonight's program really looks at the history of healers, looking at the history of the Underground Railroad and also the Black Power movement to today's ongoing resistance struggles against anti-Black racism and police brutality. Activists and healers in every moment for Black and Brown liberation have included strategies around care and protection. In the early 2000s in southeastern United States, the Kindred Healing Justice Collective, which is a network of Black, Indigenous, LGBTIQ, and women of color organizers, political healers, and health practitioners, were witnessing a national rise in anti-Black racism, anti-immigration policies, Islamophobia, criminalization of poverty, and homophobic violence. At the same time, they were experiencing an increase in suicides and immense burnout among organizers in their communities. In response, the collective began using the term healing justice as a framework to elevate the role of healing for our collective survival, well-being, protection, and liberation, and to identify how to holistically respond to and intervene in generational trauma, violence, and oppression. This conversation on the role of healing and political liberation will examine the ways that racism and inequality are embedded in and abetted by Western-based health models and frameworks. Soros Equality Fellow Kara Page, a founding member of the Kindred Healing Justice Collective, will be in conversation with historian, curator, and writer Jack Chen and artist Annika Yee to explore how disease has been used as a justification for colonialism, oppression, exploitation, and the policing of Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, and other communities under attack. Exploring this theme from both historical and contemporary perspectives, looking at the medical industrial complex, eugenics, colonial history, and the COVID-19 pandemic from a cross-racial standpoint, we will then examine how a healing justice framework could help us radically reimagine physical, emotional, societal, and environmental well-being across a variety of movements. This event will provide live American Sign Language interpretation, and thank you so much to the interpreters for being here tonight. First, before I introduce the panelists, I would just love to share Kara's definition of healing justice. Healing justice is a political framework rooted in Black feminist and Southern Black radical tradition that seeks to intervene on generational trauma from systemic violence and oppression, policing and violence by recovering, remembering ancestral medicine, and or building new traditions that center our psychic, emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, and environmental well-being for our collective liberation. This framework was conceived in 2005 by the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective, a Black-led, multiracial network of healers, practitioners, and organizers from the South. The time tonight will be spent with panelists giving 10-minute presentations, and I will introduce them each before they present. And then we will also have a moment for a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and our colleagues, Veronica and Mungna from the Culture and Art Program, will pass them to me so that we can bring them up at the end. So I will start by reading Kara's bio. Kara is a Black queer feminist cultural memory worker, a curator, and an organizer. For the past 30 plus years, she has organized with LGBTQ, GNCI, people of color, and indigenous liberation movements in the US and the global South at the intersections of racial, gender, and economic justice, healing justice, and transformative justice. She's leading a new project, Changing Frequencies, which is an archival, memory, and cultural change project to intervene on generational trauma, seeking to unveil and hold accountable the medical industrial complex as an extension of state control and policing. She's also building care and safety strategies within global movements, which she began organizing nationally in 2007 at the Social Forum, the US Social Forum in Atlanta, and in 2010 at the US Social Forum in Detroit, and at the Health and Healing Justice People's Movement Assembly. She's one of the architects of the Healing Justice political strategy, which is deeply rooted in Black feminist traditions and shaped by Southern Black radical traditions. She's a co-founder of the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective and the former executive director of the Audre Lorde Project. She is a recent recipient of the Soros Equality Fellowship and an activist in residence at the Barnard Research Center for Women. Kara, thank you so much for being here.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much. Bells and whistles. Thank you, Rashida, for holding this space, and to our ASL interpreter, Billy, and my co-panelists, Jack and Annika. I have a slideshow. I think I just need to jump right in. If we could just put that up, so that can be my guide for my 10-minute presentation. It has, yes, thank you so much. To the people behind the curtain making it all happen, I appreciate you. Thank you so much. So I just want to give honor and deep respect and gratitude to 4 movements that deeply root the framing of healing justice: the environmental justice movement, the transformative justice movement, the disability justice movement, and the reproductive justice movement. All 4 of these movements are really center our relationship to land, work, body, economy, to understanding our interdependence with one another in building collective care and safety as integral to political liberation. So with that, I wanted to start my presentation with a quote by a dear friend, comrade, and teacher, Aurora Levins Morales from Puerto Rico, who has written many books on these intersections of land, work, body, economy, and how they intersect with healing in relationship to movements. In her book, Kindling, Writings on the Body, quote, "What our bodies require in order to thrive is what the world requires. If there is a map to get there, it can be found in the atlas of our skin and bone and blood, in the tracks of neurotransmitters and antibodies. We need nourishment. We need equilibrium. We need water, connection, and justice. I just want to start here with that grounding. Thank you. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the medical industrial complex. Part of the intention of the Healing Justice political framework was to offer an analysis that pushed up against this idea that Western-based models of care are the only models of care in the world. And we deeply at the Kindred Healing Justice Collective are committed to understanding and honoring the different traditions that we feel in our communities as poor, as rural, as indigenous, as Black, as people of color, as immigrants, as queer and trans, as healers, energy, earth, plant-based healers and teachers. We often, organizers, we often are not seen as contributing to the map of political liberation. We often are not called on for our practices as important as strategy, right? To understand healing in relationship to trauma from oppression, trauma from colonization, from slavery, from attempted genocide, has been deeply a part of all of our movements. But again, I would say I've only heard that spoken to and named inside the environmental justice movement, the transformative justice movement, the environmental justice movement, and the reproductive justice movement, where they honored the role of healing that is indigenous to many of our communities and does not always come through a white, Western, male, straight, able-bodied frame. But here, we are, inside of this moment of COVID, deeply impacted by the medical industrial complex, which I often speak to as a system that has been deeply rooted in colonization, slavery, genocide, population control, and eugenics. This visual here is a lot to take in. It's been co-created by many disability justice organizers, as well as Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, and myself, who co-created this over 15 years ago to understand the role of how scientific racism has been deeply embedded in how our cultures understand health, or this economy of health and disease. And this has all come to a particular head because of COVID-19 and this global pandemic. But for 15 or so years, we've been studying and organizing around, if you look at the 4 boxes in the center, we've been pushing up against eugenics, this idea of genetically removing the genetic material of communities because we are seen as less than human. That includes people with disabilities, that includes Black people, people of Asian, Arab, African descent, Latinx descent, who have been targeted as only reproducing for the wealthy elite through labor. And if we're not reproducing to build capitalism or for the wealthy elite, then we are seen as less than. And if we are considered to bring disease, or that becomes a security issue, if we are seen as disease, then we should be removed. Certainly eugenics is much bigger than this, but we've been pushing up against eugenics in our political organizing work inside of disability justice and inside of healing justice, and asking the question of what does it mean to be desirable? Who gets to be desired and who does not? Who gets to be cared for and who does not, based on race, class, ability, age, gender, sexuality, so on and so forth. And we also look at population control through the healing justice frame that asks the question, why are we still relying on a system of care that deeply believes that women of color's fertility is the root cause of environmental degradation? This informs wars, this informs legal, legislative, policy making all over the world. It is so incessant that many of us don't even know that that's still being used as a belief system, but it deeply informs the reasons for targeting women of color and Black women and Indigenous women for massive sterilizations, or other kinds of gynecological procedures to be used on our bodies because we're seen as a threat to global security, because we are seen as adding too many people to the world and adding too much dependency on the planet, when the actual root cause in environmental degradation is war and the toxicities from war. So let's move to the next one, because this slide is big. But I want to say that healing justice also connects to historical and generational trauma. And for movement organizers in the early 2000s in the South, we took it upon ourselves to center the role of trauma in our work, in our movement work, that we had to understand individual, collective, and generational trauma as deeply embedded, and how we were thinking about our futures. How would we heal unhealed grief and unhealed trauma from slavery and colonization in order to free ourselves to have radical imagination towards moving towards our future? Generational trauma is talked about a lot more now, but 15 years ago in the South, we noticed it wasn't being talked about enough. And I want to give deep respect and credit to many scholars, especially global South feminists, who have been deeply studying and working and creating around generational trauma for decades, including Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who asked the question, if we are not facing on a cellular level, the passing on of generational trauma and grief, if that goes unhealed, then where will we rest? Where will we imagine ourselves outside of being in relationship to stress, pain, surveillance, and colonization? Next slide. So I think I only have a few minutes. The work that I'm centering around right now is around the medical industrial complex, a system of care that truly believes healthy is defined by white, male, able-bodied, cisgendered, wealthy Christian ideals of who is pure, who is sinful, who is diseased, and who is undiseased. These concepts, we believe through the healing justice lens, have to be reckoned with, and to understand generational trauma from scientific experimentation and beliefs of the medical industrial complex are deeply embedded in a disease-based economy that centers capitalism, that still centers exploitation and systemic oppression, and does not center the care of our communities. I'll move to the next slide. And I'll close on this. My work right now has been to create and curate spaces that unveil the medical industrial complex from the 1400s. Now, I'm working on a timeline co-designed by my comrades, Dr. Anjali Taneja and Susan Raffo, and many other organizers in multiple movements who want to wrestle with what is our unresolved grief and unresolved trauma from the industry of the medical industrial complex. And what does that look like now in this moment of COVID when we see such massive inequities? How will we transform our relationship to land, work, body, and spirit to remember? This is memory work, to remember how we honor traditions of care and healing that are not sold back to us by big pharma. I'm doing one next slide. I'm doing a current the one after this, current homage to honor some of the spaces that we, if only we could go to each site where there's been experimentation and scientific racism and abuse from the colonization to now to the future. But I am choosing sites off of the medical industrial complex timeline we're creating to visit or pay cultural homage to those that have died from being tested on and experimented on by this system. This is an image of the Milledgeville Central State Hospital in Georgia that for over 90 years was one of the largest mental health institutions in the world that did shock treatments, lobotomies, and ongoing scientific experimentations on Black and white poor rural bodies in the South. Still to this day, it has not been named as an institution of violence and has not been challenged for the system that it perpetuated and the abuse and harm it has created. And there are many sites of practice in the medical industrial complex, but this one in particular, Um, I am paying homage to over thousands of Black people that died in this facility that are still in an unmarked grave on the 1,000+ acre land, and doing a virtual reality piece to gather people to honor those that have died in the idea of medical science industry, but not in the honoring of the people that they were serving. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cara, for that powerful presentation. And I just want to introduce Annika next. And Annika Yee is an artist who maintains a practice focused on co-subjectivity. Her work often fuses multi-sensory experience with synthetic and evolutionary biology to form lush biofictional landscapes. Utilizing what she calls biopolitics of the senses, Annika challenges traditional approaches to the human sensorium. Through her research and techno-sensual artistic exploration, Annika is opening new discourse in the realms of cognition, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, introducing concepts of the sensorial ecology of intelligence, machine ecosystems, and biologized machines. Annika's recent solo exhibitions include Gladstone Gallery in Brussels, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, and the Kunsthalle in Basel, the Kitchen, and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Her work is also featured in the 58th Venice Biennale. In 2016, Annika was awarded the Hugo Boss Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Contemporary Art. Thank you, Annika, for being with us tonight.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Rashida, and thank you for the organizers at Open Society for inviting me, and of course to my fellow panelists, Kara and Jack. I look forward to a robust collective conversation after our presentations. In thinking about, could we put up a slide while I try to cobble together an introduction? In thinking about how to approach this presentation, one thing that I wanted to tie in as a theme that I hope to sort of transition to when we have the group conversation is this notion of a behavioral immune system. Kind of riffing on sort of, Kara's presentation, my interpretation also is it's something that where we are entangled currently in a biological social pandemic. And we tend to exploit biology to support and substantiate racist and xenophobic ideas and attitudes. And because human beings cannot readily detect disease or illness in others, like other animals can, there are certain insects, that can detect, sickness in other insects, and then they will sequester them. And because we don't have that ability to detect an illness in our societies or our population, we tend to use unreliable cues and clues as to what is sickness and what is ill, and that in and of itself, it develops a kind of behavioral immune system, and it's triggered by inaccurate, data. It's and also just inaccurate sort of biases and prejudices like the color of your skin, your gender, your nationality, ethnicity, and what have you. And historically, a lot of racist regimes have exploited the fear of infection as a tool. I mean, I think most famously Nazi propaganda elevated a fear of like the stranger infection, against Jewish people and other minorities. But anyway, I don't want to get off too much on a tangent, but let me establish where I'm coming from in this kind of lexicon of how I organize my practice and how I can contribute to, this larger conversation. What you're seeing in this slide is an image of a diorama at the Guggenheim. And this was a show that took place in 2017. I was invited to do the show. I won the prize, and it was right when Trump got elected. And I was kind of stumped. I really thought, what do I do? How do I respond as an artist? I think a lot of people look to artists to sort of, make an example or to imagine possibilities of how to address difficult times, politically, socially. And I think that one of the things that artists have to equally be as adept with is listening as much as dispensing and addressing and diagnosing, certain conditions societally. I think we have to listen. And so really, I was like everyone else, gripped with the news and current events and everything that was unfolding under this new agenda, new administration. And this was really right when he went into office. There were threats of, the Muslim ban, and I'm sure everyone here remembers the vivid imagery of all these yellow taxi cabs flooding JFK and the airport, and people collectively, protesting this threat and saying, no, we are not okay with that. So with next slide, please. So with that in mind, I wanted to create an atmosphere of tension, of anxiety. Next slide, please. Sorry, I don't know. I think the order of my slides are not great. So let's go to the next slide. Here we go. Okay, so the entry into this exhibition, I'm just going to describe a little bit about what you're seeing to contextualize everything. So these are insecticide canisters that are transmitting a scent that I created, and a scent that I worked with a perfumer, a forensic chemist, and another artist, and we worked together to create this hybridized smell. I work a lot in olfaction, mostly as a kind of sort of counterpoint statement, against the pervasive ocular-centric normative vision society that we are immersed in. And I think that there's a growing curiosity of alternative paths about other senses. And I want to shift the perception through the other senses and influence the forces that compose the field in which perception occurs. So, and I believe that because we are too ocular centric, we have lost our empathic core. And it's through the other senses that I believe we can try to rebuild this core, whereas vision has been privileged within a post-Kantian aesthetics of disinterestedness and autonomy. Smells immersive and visceral qualities make empathy unavoidable. So I wanted to imagine what it would be like to be a hybridized multi-species. Of course, as a human being, I already am that. My body is comprised of a multitude of other organisms, fungi, virus, bacteria, and yet I wanted to hybridize even more. And so I created the smell of carpenter ants, and I combined that with the smell of Asian diasporic women in Manhattan, New York City. And so the idea was that you would enter the exhibition, you would take in the odor into your pores. And this is really important, the description, the process of experiencing art, which is kind of, relatively new. I mean, I think Duchamp was maybe one of the first contemporary artists really to work with olfaction. But this all means that I make transcorporeal art. And what does that mean? That means that I make art that gets activated. It's in a collaborative sense. It goes into the bodies of the experiencers, the visitors, people who come and experience my exhibitions. That they become actively engaged, enlisted into this kind of collaboration and exchange. Next slide, please. So the idea being you inhale scent, and that it would spirit you away into this imbued reality perception of a part ant, part human kind of reality. And so that is how you enter into the exhibition, and you see these sort of dioramas, which are, kind of reminiscent or referencing natural history museums, and this kind of frozen sort of moment in time, this tableau. That next slide, please. And this Actually, you know what? Can we go backwards? I'm sorry. Go back to the microbial dioramas. Now I can talk about these. So what I did was go back one more, please. What I did was I took samples, microbial samples from the Asian diasporic community in Manhattan, and I swabbed door handles and things like that. And then what you're seeing are 220 tiles. Filled with agar that are growing the microbes, and it's as you can see, it's pervading across all these surfaces, and it's contained in this climate controlled, almost what I would call a glorified refrigeration unit, because we had to keep the optimal temperature for the microbes, which is something like 77 degrees, and a very high humidity, for the microbes to really proliferate and give them the luxurious environment that they so love. And so yeah. Next slide. Can we go back to the ant diorama slide? Sorry, I keep jumping across the board. And someone's going to tell me, right, if I need to get off this. I don't know. I don't know how long how far into this presentation I am. But anyway, so as you can see these microbial blooms that are growing, and then you have next slide. You have an opposing diorama the way, next slide, and then you have these a sort of kind of like a data center, processing center, and you see this kind of dizzying sort of like multiple layers of these circuits and these networks and these pathways. And next slide, and then you have inhabited 10,000 carpenter ants inside of these sort of pathways. And that is also kind of speaking to the sort of unindividuated Asian laborer, right? There's a lot of a common sort of racist association that all Asian people look like ants, right? There's that famous intersection in Japan, in Tokyo, in Harajuku, right? And you just see a sea of like black heads crossing the street at this busy intersection. And I've often heard that, people just look at that in awe and say, oh, that just looks like a swarm of ants crossing the street. And so, like, next slide, it's a kind of riff on that association. Oh, let's go back. I'm sorry. Go back to the other slide backwards. We don't need to go. Okay, yeah, we'll just stay there. So that you have these two dioramas, and I don't know if I have time to talk about the kitchen exhibition, so I'm not really going to say much more beyond the Guggenheim slides, just because I want to be able to focus on how olfactory empathy is something that I'm really trying to actively think about. Is that my timer that I need to stop talking? Will someone tell me? Will someone interject? Because I haven't been timing this. Okay. So
maybe 1 minute.
Okay, so
Thank you.
it's essentially what I'm, to be able to activate olfactory empathy in lieu of melodramatic imagery for an art installation, and how we can shift an aesthetic experience and be able to accommodate, this what Rashida mentioned in my introduction, the biopolitics of the senses, and how through a transcorporeal sort of journey and becoming that crosses geographical, racial, and spatial boundaries. That was really what I was trying to do, is to try to intersect, the multi-species, the microbe, the ant, the human, the machine, in this space that is historically designated, for sterility, and from a conservation point of view for all museums, right? Air is a huge important sort of like concern, and it's a vulnerability because you're trying to protect these old master works, and the air is climate controlled in most museums in the world, and yet air is such an important medium for work when you make art like I do, that deals with olfaction, that deals with the transcorporeal exchange, that really foregrounds and highlights the porousness, the wetware that humans are made of, and this kind of this sort of what I would say, that there are no crisp edges in evolution, right? So I have a problem with like even species. I have a problem with Darwin because we don't have these clear delineated boundaries between species. We are, if anything, overlapped, and more than anything, what I would define as we are as nested ecosystems. Anyway, I'm going to just stop there and await to join the group conversation. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Annika. And we will have time to get deeper into some of what you raised here. So thank you so much.
Great.
I will now introduce Jack Chen, who is a historian, a curator, and a writer. He's the inaugural Clement A. Price Chair of Public History and Humanities at Rutgers University, Newark, and director of the Clement Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. Jack is the founding director of the Asian Pacific American Studies Program and Institute at New York University. He's also co-founded the Museum of Chinese in America in 1979 to 1980, where he continues to serve as senior historian. His 2014 book, Yellow Peril, an archive of anti-Asian fear, is a critically acclaimed archival study of images, excerpts, and essays on the history and contemporary impact of paranoia and xenophobia. He recently established Newark Public History Project, which will reframe the history of the Asturio region, starting with the twined foundational histories of dispossession and enslavement. Thank you so much, Jack, for being here.
Well, thank you, Rashida. It's an honor and privilege to be here with the Open Society Foundation. And thank you, Kara and Annika. I just kind of want to jump in and start talking, and have our discussion. It's already been so rich and fantastic. And thank you, the ASL interpreters as well. Really appreciate the open accessibility that this program has. I first want to acknowledge that I'm up here in coastal Maine, the land of the Abenaki peoples, and who are also known as the people of the dawn, of the morning sun. And they are relatives of the land in which I live in Brooklyn and the land in which I work in Newark, which is the land of the Munsee Lenape peoples. And oftentimes, Algonquian language-speaking peoples refer to the Munsee Lenape as the grandfather peoples because their language emerges from the ancient sociolinguistic structures of the Munsee Lenape dialect. But it's also to say that I want to acknowledge really a worldview and a relationship to the land in which all is understood as alive. So it's not just the soil, it's not just the air, it's also the wind, it's also the rocks, and that the time scale of all this is different. So I'm really reflecting on the incredibly important work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, in which she talks about all that's alive, and that instead of the pronouns he or she or whatever pronouns we use, we should be using the pronouns of ki and kin, referring to our relationship to all that is living. It provides a very, very different orientation in terms of how we think of ourselves as humans, but also gives us a humility in terms of our relationship to nature itself. And if there's any moment in my lifetime, this is a moment of humility, when everything kind of stopped, and all of a sudden, nature kind of kicked in again, and lots of waters became clear, lots of air became clear, and I think we all felt a need to get outside and to kind of heal ourselves by walking, right? By walking outside and moving our bodies and looking around us. So I just kind of wanted to offer that as a kind of an opening framework. But it's really wonderful to be in conversation about the medical-industrial complex, which acknowledges a deep historical, multi-generational kind of era of violence, and then also to be working with Annika's really fantastic kind of creative work that links how our senses themselves have been habituated into certain kinds of regimes of colonization and ways of thinking. So that the diorama itself is actually a wonderful example of that. And that the Museum of Natural History, in fact, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, in fact, was the site of the Second International Eugenics Congress in 1921. So we're coming up to the 100th anniversary of that event. And that the dioramas themselves are linked in that deep sense of how representation and how reality is kind of created out of that context. But I thought what I'd like to talk about, okay, so is really about this question of how archives, research, history, and storytelling are part of this healing approach. And that a lot of this is not understood because the dominant histories that we live with, the dominant narratives, the dominant founding myths of, let's say, the Dutch purchase of Manhattan are so kind of in the air. It's like the air we breathe. At the same time, they are suffocating. And we don't realize how suffocating these stories actually are. So I wanted to really talk about how we need to decolonize really our research, decolonize our storytelling, decolonize our histories, decolonize our archives, so that we can begin to actually develop an archive of feelings, for example. And I borrow this term from Anne Sekovich, who is this fantastic queer scholar who talks about the necessity to recover archives of feelings of queer people over time, over many generations. And it really applies as a notion to all people who have been marginalized and really ignored in terms of what the master narratives talk about. And therefore silencing the histories to the edges, silencing the feelings, especially silencing the sensate and the sensorium, which are configured differently in cultures of difference. So I wanted to give a little bit of a history of that. And if we could begin with the slides, please. This is going to be a non-traditional history, so you have to kind of bear with me. So I'm beginning with dandelions, okay? Of course, you've got the quote, life, liberty, and happiness, which you all recognize as Thomas Jefferson's kind of tweak of John Locke's, the British political philosopher John Locke, who influenced the Anglo-American Constitution. His formulation was life, liberty, and property. And I think if we go back to his formulation, in some ways we understand really American history in a way that gets us towards diagnosing what the original ailment of this country has been. So of course, property is not only understood as buying a house, it's also understood as self-ownership, but it's also understood as owning others and having and who has the right, who has the ability, who has the intellect, who has the culture to own others, right? So if we begin to understand property in that fuller sense that was really intended at the time, then we begin to get at some of the foundational questions that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So, yes, so dandelions are an obsession of mine because as a refugee anchor child coming to the United States, we somehow ended up in a suburb outside of Chicago. And that suburb outside of Chicago was divided into these little boxes that you see. The Malvina Reynolds song of little boxes is very real in all sorts of ways, very real in terms of a shaping of a certain kind of mentality and kind of defining a certain kind of world. So I arrive with my mother talking about China, and I'm arriving into this suburb in which all the houses are the same and we all have a little piece of lawn. And in that lawn, the enemy of that lawn is crabgrass, but also dandelions. Okay, so I was brought up with this idea that I would have my own dandelion puller, this stick with a metal prong that would get at the roots of dandelions, and that I needed to pick 100 dandelion weeds out of our lawn every day, okay? And that's how I would earn my keep. So dandelions became my childhood obsession, okay? In the middle of this fairyland that had been really part of the land grant that was given to white settlers. And of course, the town's names were Algonquian, were Sauk Trail, were all sorts of native names, and we would find in the fields arrowheads. But as this immigrant refugee kid, it made no sense to me. It made no sense to me. All these suburban families were migrants from the inner city neighborhoods that they came from, a mix of Italians, a mix of Irish, a mix of Jews, but basically mainly Christians who are Catholic and also Protestants. And I couldn't quite figure out where home was because certainly my mother was talking really as a refugee saying, we're going back to China, don't get used to this place, you know. And all around me was a very different kind of world that made no sense. So for me, this historical question became, where is home? Next slide, please. And this question really, decades later, has resulted in not just starting the Museum of Chinese in America and kind of unpacking the history of yellow peril as it emerged in Europe as a way of counter-distinguishing Europe from the East, and Istanbul became kind of a key dividing line between East and West, but also the formulation of yellow peril. And we can talk more about that, but I'm not going to get into that. But part of what my own work was about is, well, how did Chinatown become Chinatown? And what I began to discover is that it had really nothing to do with Chinese people. It had nothing to do with restaurants and laundries. It had to do with a deeper kind of rooting that was brought over by the Dutch and brought over by the Puritan and English and Calvinist settlers. So for me, this question of home has been transformed into how can I unpack and understand the earlier history of the dispossession of native peoples from the land, but also the enslavement that followed on the heels of the dispossession. And the question of home really then has to go back to the dandelion question, which is the question of the nature of the land before it was split up into all those little parcels. For me, this question is really about the estuary. It's no longer about the Hudson River and what's across the Hudson River, which is New Jersey, and Brooklyn, or downtown Manhattan, or Chinatown. I'm trying to break open those artificial boundaries that we have since developed and try to understand the larger region as a whole of water, of land, of air, of the soil, of what was happening in the thousands of years in which the indigenous peoples, the Lenape, the Algonquin language speaking peoples, how they had lived with the land, with a certain kind of intimacy of knowledge and a way of really stewarding the land and the cycles of how life formed in relationship to the migrating fish, for example, up the saltwater Hudson River. Whales were in fact spotted breaching the Hudson River itself. Going back to a moment of enormous biodiversity in which oysters were described as being 18 inches in size, right? Going to a moment in which the biodiversity of the land was not just kind of God-given or by Mother Nature, but was actually cultivated by the indigenous people for thousands of years. So this notion, this false notion that John Locke presented, that somehow this was nature and that that the native peoples were simply living as a part of nature and were not were kind of idle because of the bounty of the places such as this estuary. They didn't do anything to the land. They were not farmers, therefore they did not know how to own the land, and they did not know how to own themselves. So the fundamental question of the political philosophy as it entered with the colonists also defined and began to affect how that land would be treated and divided up. Next slide, please. And that system of insisting that the land should be privatized, that the commons that were shared should be privatized, really emerged with not only the Puritans coming from the north, impinging through Connecticut and waging massacres, Pequot War, but also crossing over Long Island Sound and waging massacres in places like Pavonia. Pavonia, for those of you who don't know the area, is really where Liberty State Park is today. And Pavonia was a site in which Governor Kift hired a bunch of mercenaries, including John Underhill, who was the leader of the massacre of the Pequots. And they came down, and in the year 1623, waged a massacre nearby a Dutch trading post in which scores of women and children were massacred. Now, there's a wave of these massacres, and it was a wave of massacres that began to introduce the private property system down from Massachusetts into Connecticut, into Long Island, and across New York City and into New Jersey. So what happened, next slide please. What happened is that the shared commons lands, the shared lands of the Lenape, and you can see the map here in which the Lenape peoples, the Munsee are really north of the Raritan, and south of the Raritan are the Unamis. But the next slide, please. But this land that was really a commons quickly became split up by so-called deeds that were of enormous sizes. So you can see the Elizabethtown purchase, so-called purchase, in 1664, 500,000 acres, just transferred. So you see the history in which these common lands of the indigenous peoples were transferred bit by bit over the decades in massive amounts. And these very same so-called purchases were immediately turned into plantations. And these plantations then, of course, took advantage of the dispossessed, cleared spaces, supposedly cleared spaces, and they introduced enslavement. And the enslavement plantations that were here in New Jersey and here in the North had ongoing relationship with the plantations in the South and plantations in the Caribbean, providing foodstuffs, providing financing. So there's really a larger system in which the North was intricately involved in the enslavement system. But to the point is that suddenly the land became possessed by private property systems and divided up increasingly, so that any ability to understand the land as a whole was broken down increasingly by the private ownership and development of, quite frankly, many corrupt British, but also corrupt Dutch people. Next slide, please. And the violence of that, the violation of the shared commons increasingly being enclosed, is really at the core of this question. And someone like the sociologist Max Weber began to kind of analyze what was going on in this, in the development of this new world. And I'm just trying to keep track of my time, so I hope I'm not going too much over. And I'll just kind of wrap up soon. And it's really formulated by this very important book, which has oftentimes been kind of misunderstood, I think. But how does the Protestant ethic, in particular Calvinism, also interlink with the spirit of capitalism, of making money, of treating everything, the land, everything on the land, as something that should be massively extracted from the trees to the ore to the beavers, and just basically denuded of its natural relationships of Mother Nature itself, and really be part of the trading system of way of making money. And virtue could be measured by how one did that work every single day as a good Protestant, right? So we're talking about a much more complex spiritual system in which extractivism becomes linked to a certain kind of Protestant work ethic. Next slide, please. And that contradiction existed, that contradiction existed within Protestantism itself in terms of the internal rigidity and discipline of our senses and the way we carry ourselves, and really repressing the need to have fun, repressing the need to relax, repressing the need to enjoy our sexuality as creatures, repressing the need to dance and to move and to sing. All those things became very defined by the Calvinists as things that were not good to do. Next slide, please, and I'm going to wrap up real soon. So you have basically the patriarch really taking on the role of disciplining the child. Next slide, please. And creating this sense of the other within oneself. In other words, if one is laughing, one is dancing around, one has to be self-disciplined, and if one is not self-disciplined, you are bad. But also that becomes a form of projecting it onto others, outsiders, who do not fall within that kind of disciplinary regime. Next slide, please. And this also, of course, affects children, and the violence that happens, that becomes internalized through this kind of Calvinist culture, that becomes part of the political culture at large. Next slide, please. And that becomes a form of projection itself. We can go further into this in terms of psychosocial dimensions of generations of harm that are then carried on for tens, 20s, hundreds of years in the political culture of the nation. Next slide, please. But I just want to return to the dandelion, okay? The dandelion itself is a migrant. The dandelion itself came from Eurasia and came with the people who crossed the land bridges. And we think of dandelions as weeds. We think of dandelions as dandelion tea and something healthy to eat, dandelion salads. Next slide, please. And in fact, dandelions themselves have been part of a binary in which they're weeds and evil and dangerous, and we will put cancer-causing chemicals to kill those horrible things in our lawns. But then it also creates cancer within ourselves. We know that with a lot of the weed killers that have been used. Or they're romanticized as beautiful parts of nature, and they're just seen as, the solution to everything. But in fact, dandelions, next slide, please, cannot be reduced to a binary. And that binary itself is part of the deeply unhealthy part of the culture itself. I'm just going to stop there and really say that going back to a natural understanding of how we as human beings are part of nature and not somehow standing aside from nature and so somehow superior from nature, but that we are part of nature is the beginning of the healing process. I'm just going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. And I really want to just launch us into a conversation because this has been so incredibly rich. And so I wanted to just, raise a few of the things that I've heard from the three of you, really around this idea of land and sites of trauma um, the sensory, the microbial, really as kind of carriers, right, of not only history but memory. And I really want to just ask you all, and you can go in order of how you presented the question about how does this work, this framework of healing justice, actually allow us to tap into these kind of various layers that, of historical trauma, generational trauma in the body, historical trauma in the land, and in the plants, and also, the kind of trauma that exists in our memory. How are we able to use a healing justice framework to really tap into this and to address this?
I'll jump.
Okay, Kara, if you want to respond, you can.
Go
I'll
ahead.
go after you because I actually have a question for Jack related to Rashida's question. So
Oh,
why don't
fantastic.
you
Oh,
take it
well,
away?
I was just going to talk about reclamation. I think Jack and Annika spoke a lot about cosmologies, right? This idea that we are, I was kind of looking at the medical industrial complex, looking at that we are less than human as immigrants, as Black bodies, as indigenous, um, as disabled, all the things, as disabled people. There's this idea that we are less than human. Go with me on this. And then here we are reclaiming through all of our work this reclamation of we are more than human. Right? Like we are, I mean, I always speak to Joy Harjo's work, um, and so much of her writing, her poetry is about, we are stars in the universe. And, this whole panel, can healing be our North Star, right? A direct reference to Harriet Tubman. I have a piece that I've performed many times about Harriet Tubman saw something beyond the North Star, right? She saw cosmologies of a universe that took us far beyond towards liberation, something we haven't imagined before. So this moment of the pandemic and through a lens of healing justice asks us the question, one, to reimagine something we've never had the opportunity to even conceive, because so many of us, our generations, have not been living, breathing, engaging with the universe outside of surveillance, outside of slavery, outside of colonization and capitalism. So what then, right? So we have the most impossible, but I think the most powerful, to imagine something we've actually never felt before, right? But then this piece around cosmologies of a universe that embraces us beyond our physical skin, that so many of us, for myself as a memory worker and cultural worker, we're all telling story here. And I think we all touch this idea of story, of cells, of microbials, I didn't even get into sound, some of the sound installations I've done around healing from generational trauma. These are the multi-sensory ways that we're all speaking to story. And I believe my project is called Changing Frequencies because I believe we are truly changing the vibrations and patterns and codes that have oppressed us and trying to imagine new frequencies, new patterns that will need imagination beyond colonization. And this is, I think it's hard work, but I think it's possible. So I'll stop there.
So I just wanted to respond. Thank you for that, Kara. I'm thinking about a lot of things currently in our discussion. One of the things is that I think, throughout this pandemic, I have had to learn a lot. It was like coming out of the Platonic cave and seeing reality anew for the first time. I didn't absorb how pervasive systemic racism was in this world, as a person of color, and like just having to learn this and starting to build. I mean, not that it started in March when we all went into lockdown, but having to build a new lexicon that is written for us and by us, not this kind of whitewashed language of a version of events. i.e. history. We have to articulate it for ourselves. We can't expect to just be handed down these stories, these mythologies, just these accounts of what happened throughout history, because they're not coming from maybe the most trustworthy perspectives. But one thing I wanted to say, like when I was listening to Jack's presentation, it's going to sound a little persnickety, Jack, but I think that in the interest of precision and clarity, I think we need to start thinking about this term decolonize. I read a really incredible paper called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it really schooled me, because we tend to use this term decolonization as a metaphor of how to improve societies, improve schools. There's even a group called Decolonize the Museum, and these are all metaphors and they're not accurate, because actually what decolonization really means is the repatriation of native land and culture. And everything else is really an entanglement of settler, native, slave sort of, triad. And so by that extension, we don't even have immigrants in this country. We have settlers. I'm a settler. I had always identified somewhat as an immigrant or a child of immigrants, but we're actually all settlers. We're not immigrants. And so I think that it changes the relationship to land. It changes my relationship to America. I'm an American citizen. And yet, increasingly, I feel stateless because we are occupying land that is stolen from Native people, built by enslaved people. So to me, we're not free. This is not a real true state in that regard. And so I think that it's important that we try to examine the language that we use and if it's serving us and if it's functioning in the proper way. And so it further complicates my relationship to this country, my citizenship, relationship to like the soil, the terroir, as Jack was, explicating. And so just a simple word like decolonization and getting that wrong shifts everything for me. And I don't mean to sound, again, persnickety, like, oh, it's all about the precision of language. And if you don't have the proper vocabulary and if you don't have the proper meaning, then we can't have a discussion. That's not what I'm suggesting. My question to Jack is, how do you relate, as this vessel, let's call it vessel. And I appreciate that, Kara, you really nailed it for me, the more than human. That's what I would call, a lot of where my perspectives come from. I am not a post or transhumanist. I am thinking about more than human aspects. And what is the future of that? And what does that intersection look like? But my question to Jack is so how do you relate to your status, do you relate as an immigrant, a settler? I mean, where do we begin? What is our point of entry to be in a room together, on stolen land built by enslaved people? How do we inhabit this land today? How do we do that?
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm glad you're just moving right to that point, which is critical. I don't use it. Well, perhaps in my historical analysis, it comes off as being metaphorical, but I actually use it as historical language, which is trying to get at a precise kind of change of relationship that settler colonists have through extraction practices that becomes a system that gets tied into a global marketplace. How that also then becomes a way that redefines all kinds of relationships of everybody who comes into that land, right? So when I'm talking about the enclosures of common lands, it's really how that land becomes privatized by the early colonists, the Dutch and the British, who have all of Staten Island, who have all of Manhattan Island, then they give it to their friends, and then 500,000 acres of Elizabethtown patent. How that transfer of lands that becomes dispossessed and then becomes enslaved spaces, then defines the reality of all subsequent people who move into that space. So all the settlers who descend from those early colonists and who then migrate from England, migrate from Amsterdam, and then all the subsequent migrants who come after that are all coming into the context of basically dispossession and enslavement as the foundation in which their realities get both insensitized, numbed, blinded, insensate, kind of desensitized, but also the reality is defined by the new property regime system that is very much defined as an extractivist economy. So I'm really trying to use it in that historical sense, that therefore kind of my revelation, which has come late in my life, is that all this history about Asian Americans, which I've devoted so much time towards, has to be understood within that context. And without that context, it actually is not this American dream narrative, which I never quite reproduced anyhow, but is not simply the narrative of racism has affected all people of color. I'm trying to get at I'm trying to really dissect and get at the origins of the root causes of how this system of differentiation, and Kara and I have worked on eugenics. It culminates at different points in time. Eugenics is one point that I do feel that we all need to talk about. I'm not using eugenics as a metaphor either. I'm really using eugenics as a historical phenomenon, just like dispossession and enslavement are historical moments. So I see them as deeply linked. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Thank you.
Wait, can I just jump in? Oh,
yes, I was
eugenics is not eugenics is not just historical, Jack. It's contemporary. So that's the myth, right? Okay, I know you know that, but I was like, no, Jack, don't say it. Eugenics is right here with us. Okay, it's obvious, but not really. Yes.
Can I ask just a question, just in terms of, contextualizing within the COVID-19 pandemic, speaking about eugenics, and really just thinking about the world racing towards a vaccine. And, obviously concerns are raised about the research and development process for vaccines. And also, it triggers this discussion about the history of experimentation and exploitation of racialized bodies in the name of scientific progress. And so I'm wondering, from your perspectives, Kara, Annika, and Jack, really how can we learn from the past to manage the exploitative nature of the medical industrial complex, especially in this moment?
I have a problem with this obsession we have in America as the vaccine being this like magic bullet that's going to cure everything. And all of our problems are going to magically disappear. And we all know that that is not going to happen. Pfizer will release the vaccine and we will still have systemic racism. We will still have all of these inequities and nothing is fundamentally changed, really. And that is a problem that I have. And even the way that this country, this administration has handled even, like a lack of contact tracing that they have in Asian countries like South Korea, and Taiwan and places like that. We're not getting at the root of the problem. We're just trying to lazily circumvent things and just say, oh, I'll just pay, $15 trillion for a vaccine. And then that will absolve me of my responsibility as a citizen, as a person who has to engage with these societal problems day in and day out. But, a lot of people choose to just ignore that. So I do have a problem with this whole sort of solution of the vaccine and all of this focus on it rather than all the work that we've had to do since the lockdown in March of having to address a lot of these issues. We can't stop just because there's a vaccine, because for most of us, conditions will not improve. They're only going to get worse because of the economy, because of the health vulnerabilities, because of the atmospheric injustices that everyone is experiencing. A vaccine isn't going to cure like food scarcity. It's not going to cure, sort of, atmospheric racism. It's not going to cure any of those things. People will still be living under these conditions. And so this kind of magic bullet is a real problem for me. Anyway, I don't know if that's answering your question, but I just think that we're focusing on quick, easy solutions, temporary at best. We all, I think, are all very anxious about this virus mutating, that 30 more viruses are on the horizon. And, like I have a sister who's a nurse, and she would always tell me, oh, we're not going to, what's going to wipe out our species isn't nuclear war or something like that. It's really these super viruses. You work at a hospital, you see so much disease that we don't know what it is. Through modern science, we have no clue what these are, and yet it's very pervasive if you work in a hospital and you can see for yourself the sort of like the appearance of so much that science cannot catch up with.
Thank you. And I would love, Tara, if you could just talk about the sort of intersection of the issues that you just raised, Annika, around justice, right, and the development of the vaccine.
Well, it's just very hard not to say big pharma, right? Because here we are, en masse. There's so much to say about the privatization of genes and seeds. I actually was going to do my entire presentation on the privatization of genes and seeds instead of what I talked about. That is a part of the medical industrial complex, right? It is key. The landless, the workers' movements, the farmers' movements, the migrant justice movements, so much has been about the privatization of genes and seeds. And when the patenting started, right, in the early 1900s of seeds, and how that has deeply affected the hybridization of plants. And now we're looking at the hybridization of humans and the privatization of genes. But I digress. But this is part of the, this is going to become the onslaught of new vaccinations, new medicines. Like these, if we're not tracking what is happening inside of this industry, I mean, many people are tracking it. Dorothy Roberts has been tracking it, Harriet Washington, my teachers, my mentors as Black feminists, understanding our relationship to genes and seeds and medicines that are being, much to what Annika is saying, the magic bullet, that's highly dangerous. That's dangerous on so many levels. One, who's it being tested on and experimented on? Two, who's it going to value? Who's going to get access to it? And the structural oppression, as you mentioned, Annika, about the inequities. Until everyone is released from detention centers and prisons, those are the first people who are going to die and the last people to get any kind of vaccination. And then understanding our larger relationship to U.S. imperialism and global xenophobia. I'm deeply concerned the focus, right, will go on vaccinations and not on, it's been great to have Jack on this panel because of the work about yellow peril, right? Like, let's talk about the rise of xenophobic anti-Asian violence in this country, and that the government, I'll just say broadly, that blamed a country for this virus. And we can walk that out all the way, right? We could talk about, when you talk about history of eugenics, let's talk about HIV/AIDS, blaming sex workers and Black Asian people, gay and trans people. Let's talk about SARS. We can walk this we can move through all the different ways disease has been used to justify eugenic applications of removal of people. We're watching COVID being applied to asking doctors and nurses to decide who's more likely to survive based on disabilities. We are at a crisis that asks the critical moment of our humanity and our dignity and our integrity of how we value human existence and who we value. So the vaccination is nothing in comparison to this much broader conversation of what can we learn from this moment, and can we, I unfortunately don't believe we'll do this differently, but I am very hopeful that people's understanding of the inequities did not just begin this year or a decade ago. This was planned as a colonialist project on who has access to what, and a vaccination, how that will change the economy, is also a very important question. It's a very important question to ask of ourselves. It's not about who will it heal. This is about who will make capital off of it. That
Yes.
is really what this vaccination is about.
And I
Can
know
I?
Clara and Jack.
Oh,
Sorry, I just want to bring Jack back in because I know, Cara and Jack, you've had a conversation about this disease-based economy. And so, Jack, I don't know if you could come back in, and then Annika will come back to you.
Well, it's a disease-based economy in a number of ways. So certainly, a lot of the othering forms of racism, of homophobia, all these kinds of intersectional forms of fear are viral, and they operate in ways that are also addictive. So that I'm thinking, for example, of how, of course, we now have severe addiction in this nation through big pharma, in fact. And that just reminds me of what my mother always told me about and why we shouldn't get too comfortable in this country, because the reason why we're in this country is that the kind of conflict that was precipitated by the opium wars that were waged by the British by inflicting opium onto China, right, that basically destroyed the Chinese economy, was going to change when China had a revolution. Now, it didn't quite change as much as we would like, but it's a problem globally in terms of how exploitative colonial and imperial systems then start infecting around the world. And we're talking about literal infection of the spreading of diseases, but also the addiction onto certain kinds of goods and the inability to kind of wean ourselves off of those goods. But of course, that includes foods that are unhealthy to eat. We're talking about economies that are constantly, as our Native American friends talk about, which is this Wendigo kind of economics, an economics that is based on kind of a cannibalistic kind of feeding off of the need to make more and more money, and not a measure of human well-being, thriving societies, and cultures. So extractivism and addiction and these kinds of viral, predatory kinds of culture making is systemic. But it's not to say that it's totally controls all of our lives. I think, in fact, we come from cultures in which we don't always trade in that kind of marketization of violence and exploitation. And we are at the same time living cultures of gifting, of fair exchange, of bartering, of building health. And those systems coexist right now. They've always existed. They've been kind of shunted down. Witches were kind of burned at the stake. Heathen practices such as acupuncture or healing yourself with certain kinds of leaves and herbs, all those things were deemed really outside the commodity culture. But in fact, they've always coexisted. And I think in some ways that kind of going back to that tradition that Kara was talking about, of an older kind of practice that was more of a people's level kind of way of dealing with cures through foods, through the culture of belonging, through sharing. Those kinds of cultures coexist. And I think the challenge becomes, how can we get back to that? And in fact, how can we really support what we are doing in terms of that. There are little islands and little pockets in which we're all parts of those things, but somehow they need to be much larger and much more interconnected to really make them the kind of public culture and public health that we all need.
Thank you. And I'll just say that we have about 5 minutes left, so I want to invite you each to share something in closing, and we'll start with you, Anna.
I think what's interesting is that we're experiencing a lot of collision of ideologies, especially in response to the disease. I think in the West here, we have this individuated freedom ideology that's very stubborn, and people are just fed up with wearing masks. They're fed up with quarantining, social distancing, and all of that. And we're all enviously looking at feeds from South Korea. They're at restaurants. They're like, normal life is going on. And I'm like, what parallel universe is this? This is so insane, and it's so literal, this division of ideology, where in the East, the collective consciousness is about duty to others as well as to yourself, right? So wear a mask. It protects you and me. And so what's interesting is I'm noticing this collision also in regards to the medical industrial complex. In most developed Western countries, it isn't about survival anymore as far as like the medical research is concerned. We've contained most of the deadly diseases. Most of the world isn't afflicted with malaria. We kind of eradicated polio, except for the anti-vaxxers are bringing it back. I mean, that's a whole other panel discussion, And so like in the West, we've been kind of on cruise control when it comes to like medical advances. It's really been less about survival and living and more about enhancement, right? Plastic surgery, augmentation, how do we get smarter? And then going into like what Kara, like her premonition of, the eugenics in terms of, hybridization, splicing, you name it. I mean, a lot of things are coming down the pipeline. And I'm not against all of it either, by the way. Just, keep me in mind for that next panel.
Thank you, Annika.
Okay, yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
So I'll just ask Jack if you could have 1 minute, and then we'll end with you, Kara.
Just to get back to the vaccine question, I'm really worried that the vaccines are going to become our new addiction and drug, and that without constantly taking vaccines and spending more and more money and not being insured to be able to pay for those vaccines, that there's going to be a new kind of caste-like system that's created of those who can afford to be constantly on these vaccines. So we're going to become a little bit like vampires, right? Those who can constantly be, kind of sucking the blood, right? I love that. Thank you, Billy. Sucking the blood of other people, and those who are going to be sucked. I mean, it's that kind of question of how development operates and how marketing, kind of the marketplace operates, is really of central concern. Just a quick comment. I mean, people say it's a disease from China, but it's really a disease that's endemic to developing cultures, in which the human development is starting to edge into what had been in the wild, into the areas in which bats were living and not interacting necessarily with humans, the areas in which other creatures are living. And then you start getting the mowing down of Amazon, or the mowing down of really parts of nature. And that kind of sudden contact is, according to the medical folks who I know, that sudden contact is part of what's happening. So there's that accelerated contact and the inability of containing that, because once somebody's infected in one place, then it starts traveling through airlines, through train transportation, through cars, and through the inability of certain cultures to actually say, no, we have to really be careful here. So there's a developmental imperative that's actually spurring this. So instead of saying that it's a disease from China, it's a disease from all places that are going through rapid development and basically mowing down the natural landscape that had been quote unquote wild at one time. So that's part of the etiology of this particular pandemic that we're going through. Yeah.
Thank you. And Kara, for the final word.
The final word. I just want to say to what Annika was speaking to, I understand what you said about whatever's coming down the pipe, right? The hybridization or what's possible. I'm concerned about the ethics of that we are still in a white supremacist, ableist supremacist, racial capitalist culture. So it's not the what of it, it is the how it will be used as a weapon, which of course I know you understand. And so that is what we need to be watching for, right? And I think this moment in time, I just want to offer inside of this global pandemic is it has generated community care strategies that hearken to our ancestors. And I think that is a powerful gift. How we have been forced in some ways or asked, invited to remember what we have done in hard, impossible times, how to not rely on state for our care or our directives on our survival, because that has never worked, right? And I think it begs the question, what can we remember and what can we create based on traditions of medicine, of care, of resistance that have ensured our survival for centuries as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, especially rooted in place and in rightful relationship to the earth. What is the interdependence we can create? That's what this opportunity, I think, brings. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kara, Annika, Jack, and thank you, Billy and Maria, for your interpretation. It's an honor to have you all here at Open Society Foundations. And, we will continue this conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who joined here, and have a good evening.